Hello, this is my assignment 4.1 on ethical and legal issues in sport and exercise science research. Now in this assignment we'll be looking at the two main types of issues regarding research, bases, some codes of conduct in research, and some scenarios in which research has gone wrong. But first, what is BASES? BASES stands for the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences. BASES is the professional body for sport and exercise science in the UK. Sport and exercise science is the application of scientific principles to the promotion, maintenance and enhancement of sport and exercise related behaviours. When you do research related to sport for a degree, you have to become a member of BASES. In order to start your research project, you will have to gain authority from the appropriate governing body. The Sport 1 governing body is BASES. This will involve completing forms for both the participants and the researcher. The participants will have to sign a consent form which tells the participants what they will be doing. If the participants are under the age of 16, then a parent or guardian will have to sign the consent form for them. In the form, there will be detail about the warning and risk in which the participants could come across, and there should also be a right to withdraw if the participants want to withdraw from the project at any stage. The research will then get sent to the tutors, college or school ethical committee. The research will be looked at in detail, seeing if the project is safe and that there is a low risk of harm. Finally, the committee will confirm that the proposal is safe, in which case you can go ahead with your research, or if they believe that the research may cause harm upon the participants, then they may send the proposal back and you'll not be able to take the project any further. Once BASES have confirmed that the research is good, then you can go ahead with the project. However, you will need to make sure it is safe. During the research and the project, you have to make sure that you're always keeping into consideration the safety of the participants and also yourself. You do not want the research to turn into a real-life experiment such as the Stanford prison experiment in 1971, where the researcher actually began to run his own prison rather than thinking about the project. There are two types of safety that you need to consider of the participants and yourself. They are physical and psychological. Physical is where there is harm to the body, for example getting punched in the arm. If you're doing your project, then you need to make sure that there is no violent conduct in which a participant could get angry and hit out on another participant because they are losing. Psychological is where there is harm mentally, for example being called fat. This could be in the project where every time someone misses a shot, the researcher has a go at the participant. This could then lead them to be afraid of taking the shot. So for the project to run smoothly, the safety of the participants is a major factor. The importance of ethical and legal issues in the research of sport and exercise science is primarily based around the safety of all participants and the researcher. Putting someone in blatant physical or psychological harm will be breaking the rules of BASES. BASES will not let a researcher carry out a project if they feel like something may go wrong. For example, the researcher putting the participants at harm because it will fall back to them for giving the project allowance to go ahead and it will damage their reputation. It also ensures that researchers are working in their areas of expertise and have qualifications to carry out the research. For example, if the researcher was going to be taking some of the participants' blood throughout the project, then the researcher will have to have some qualification in dealing with blood. Finally, that the researcher is credible in order to preserve and develop the reputation of sport and exercise science. There are 3 different ways that you can be charged for not being ethical in the project. Tribunals is the first one, where the researcher can get fined, written a legal warning, and they could be banned from producing the research. This will take place if there have been any harm to the participant and the participant wants to prosecute the researcher because they breached the consent form. For example, they could have lied in the consent form or not given them the right to withdraw. You can leave yourself open to legal or civil action if something goes wrong within the project. However, you can avoid this by following the code of conduct. Finally, the last form in which you can be charged if something goes wrong in the project is that you can be banned from research in the field. So for example, in this case, the researcher will not be able to do any more research in sport and exercise science because BASES would have suspended them. Now moving on to some scenarios. The first scenario is an investigation of the role of cold vests in aid and recovery from maximal sprint intervals. The researcher in this situation may use 4 mixed abilities 15-year-old students to sprint 100 metres 15 times with a 2-second rest period in between. A safety problem that could occur with this scenario is that the vest could be too cold for the participant, which could lead to physical and psychological harm. The body would start to become cold, which could cause distress physically to the participants, and psychologically it could make them afraid of wearing vests again. This could lead to legal action against the researcher because he was putting participants at harm during the project. This could lead to legal or civil action as something went wrong during the project. However, to avoid this, they should follow the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is certain principles that the researcher may follow for them to get ethical clearance, which allows them to do the research. The researcher may have released a set of results by using a student's names when recording the set of results. This is against their data protection and confidentiality, as some people may not want any data released about themselves. For example, instead of saying subject X recovered quicker than subject Y, the researcher may have said John recovered quicker than Mary. By having this data protection, it prevents participants from social harm. This could lead the researcher to a possible suspension of doing research in sport in the future, because they have led a bad reputation on bases. They may also be taken to a tribunal and also be fined. Another issue with this project is informed consent. An example of this is that the researcher may have changed his original plans and had only told the students that they were running 10 times, not 15. This could lead the researcher to get sued because he has misled the participants into doing something more than they originally arranged. This could lead the researcher to go through the disciplinary procedure where they could be called to a tribunal. If guilty, the researcher could be stopped temporarily or permanently, and they could permanently expel you from bases, so no more research in sport and exercise science. Finally, the researcher will have to make sure that the project is unbiased. For example, in this scenario, they could give one subject a longer rest in between the sprints interval rather than the other. If they don't change the research to make sure it's not unbiased, then the researcher could face a consequence. For example, a tribunal, because the research is impartial and unbiased. Making the research impartial could damage BASE's reputation and could lead the researcher into a fine, or even a suspension from BASES, so they're not able to do any research in sport and exercise sciences again. Moving on to scenario 2, an investigation of maximal repeated sprint and lactate accumulation for adults with learning difficulties. The researcher may investigate 5 subjects running 100 metres 10 times at a high intensity with no rest in between. As participants will be doing maximal repeated sprints, this will need to be in the consent form so that the participants know what they are doing, and if they are struggling, they should have the right to withdraw. If the researcher does not give the participants the right to withdraw, then there will be legal actions that will take place. This is because in the consent form there should have been a right to withdraw, and now the researcher has taken it away from them. This could lead them to get sued and fined and possibly a suspension on BASES, either temporary or permanently, because it has damaged BASES' reputation. Also, because the participants are doing repeated sprints 5 times and they have learning difficulties, then it's a very important factor to look after their safety. An example of how the research could be unethical is if he gets the adults to sprint with masks on to prevent an intake in oxygen, because it will affect the lactate accumulation. This can be against the participants' safety, as it will physically hurt the participants running and it could cause them to dehydrate. The consequences of putting the participants at harm could lead to the research being fined or being sent to a tribunal. This is because they have not ensured the safety and welfare of the participants in the research. Another code of conduct factor is the test could be unbiased if the adults have to run different distances. For example, 2 participants run 100 metres, 3 run 150 metres, and 5 run 200 metres 10 times. This will make the research invalid because the results will be affected differently from the different distances. The researcher could be favouring certain individuals, making them run 100 metres instead of the 200 metres. This shows the researcher's impartiality. Therefore, the researcher could face some consequences, from a fine to being taken to a tribunal, where they could later be suspended from sport and exercise science research. Finally, the researcher should be aware of the data protection, so he should make sure that the data is kept in a private place where no one else can access it. However, for example, if the researcher was to release any information about the participants, like their names and results, then there will be consequences because it is social harm. Some consequences that the researcher can face for the data protection are them being sued, taken to a tribunal, and they can also be suspended in taking part in further research of sport because the research has damaged BASE's reputation. Moving on to scenario number 3, the effect of interval training on blood lactate values. In this case, a researcher was making 10 participants run 2 miles, and after the first and last mile, they will take a sample of the participants' blood from their arms to see the levels of lactic acid in the blood. The researcher will be using needles to get the blood out of the participants' arms. The researcher will have to have knowledge in the field of expertise to be working with the blood so that the safety of the participants is safe. For example, if the researcher was to hurt a participant in the process of taking blood, then the researcher could be prosecuted for not ensuring the safety of the participants. Because of this issue, the researcher could face the BASES disciplinary procedure and be taken to a tribunal and be sued by the participants or BASES because of the physical harm caused to the participants. In the concept form, the participants must have signed it to take part in the project. The researcher must have given a full report on the method and what they will be taking part in, and that they will have to be given some of their blood. If this was not in the consent form, then the researcher will be liable for legal or civil action. Most likely, the consequence of this is that they will be taken to a tribunal, and if found guilty, then they could be sentenced to a prison sentence, fined a large sum of money, and further still get suspended in future research. The researcher may have released the data by recording the results with the names of the participants alongside some information about each individual. For example, they could have said John, a worker in Asda, and Paul, a plumber, got these results. This is against the data protection, where there should be no information regarding anything about each individual. This is for social reasons, so no one can look at their records online. If the researcher does misplace this information, then the researcher will face some consequences if the participants and BASES are to prosecute them. They could face going to tribunal, where if found guilty, they could later be sued, fined, and even suspended from further research involving sport and exercise science. Finally, another ethical problem that could go wrong with this project is keeping the project balanced and fair. For example, if the researcher was to take blood values from certain individuals before the mile at 750 metres, then the set of results will be unfair and biased because they have had shorter distance run which would have required for them to use less oxygen. If the research was to be biased, then the researcher could be prosecuted with some fines because they'll be damaging the reputation of BASES because they're not making the project fair. The final scenario is the effects of punishment on performances of basketball free throw percentages. In this case, a researcher was analysing 10 participants taking 10 free throws, and every time they missed the hoop, the researcher would shout in the participant's face saying how bad they are. However, if they get the shot in, the researcher would not say anything. There are a number of ethical problems with this scenario, and the first one will be the psychological harm of the participants. Psychologically, the basketball players will be affected because when they take a free throw, they will be scared of the researcher shouting in their faces, and it will have an effect in the long run because they could remember when they missed the free throw and have a picture of the researcher shouting at their face. This could lead to the researcher having serious consequences from the amount of harm he is putting the participants in. They could potentially be fined, taken to a tribunal, and furthermore be expelled from doing further research in the sport field because they would have badly damaged the reputation of BASES. This scenario is also lacking equality and impartiality. The researcher is quite clearly favouring the basketball players who succeed in their free throws, and therefore this could be seen as being biased towards the better players. This makes the test and research invalid because the effect in the results of the test. A consequence in which the researcher may face for being biased is a suspension from future research in sport. Another ethical issue which the researcher may do is when he collects the data, he may write their names with the results, which is against data protection and confidentiality because it could affect the social harm. This could lead to the researcher being sued because they have leaked the names of the participants. Finally, before the project and the participants would have signed a consent form which agreed to them taking part in the project. This would include what they will be doing, what the project is about, and in the form should be a right to withdraw if the participants are not liking the project. However, looking at the scenario, it would have been very unlikely that the students would have wanted the researcher to be shouting in their faces. This means the researcher may be liable for legal or civil action because they have deceived the participants in signing up for something which they might not have signed. A legal action that could take place is a prison sentence. And finally, there's my bibliography of the 2 pictures I have put in the PowerPoint. Thank you for listening.